Hi everybody, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about my work pattern for designing. And you can consider this a companion video to the one I did on programming, which I'll put a link in the description. This is actually answering a question from PostNuke Productions, who asks, "You've done a few videos about what it's like to program a game, so could you give us an idea of what a day working as a designer is like?" I like this question. I'll clarify it though that I'm gonna write down what I assume it's like being a system designer. A level designer and a narrative designer would have a very different day. Level designers would work with artists more. Narrative designers would be more interested in the quests and the storyline and spend a lot of their day writing characters. So I'm going to go as if it's a system mechanic designer because that's what I'm most familiar with. By the way, you might want to check out the work pattern for programming because a lot of things I'm going to mention here are very similar to what I do when I'm a programmer. It's not that I view the same jobs as similar. It's just it's just me, how I do a job. So I'll get right into it. First of all, I like to get in early. I've said this before. I like to get in very early because most game developers don't get in early. Almost everywhere I've ever worked, when they say we want people to be in by 9, most people roll in around 9:30. They treat work hours as suggestions. I don't know why. I've seen this in game development and brought it up to my friends who work in other industries, and they're like, "Whoa, that person would be fired." You can't just like roll into your job a half an hour late and go, But that's just how a lot of game development work. They usually say our core hours are, and they have a set few of hours. They have a number of hours like between 10 and say 4. So some people come in earlier, some people come in later, but most people roll in kind of later in the day. I like to get in early because no one's around. It's very quiet. I grab some coffee. Obsidian had the best cold brew coffee machine, which I believe is the origin of my addiction to coffee itself. I find coffee to be okay. Coffee with a little chocolate flavoring, yeah. Cold brew, amazing. So I'd grab some cold brew. I'd go through my email to see if there's anything I need to take care of. And then I jump in to actually writing design docs. Like I said in my programming video, I like to leave ideas, a list of ideas on a to-do list for me to start in on the next day. Usually these are easier ones. Like I'll have an idea for something, or I'll remember, oh, I didn't go and finish that list, or I have to go change this mechanic, or somebody brought up an idea, let's explore it a little bit, see how it fits in with some other things in the game. I would put those on a to-do list, and I'd sort of organize them a little bit by priority, but also a lot by what I thought would be easy to do. That way, when I get in the morning and I start in on my tasks, you slide in to working by doing a few easy things. You knock them out, and you're like, look at me. And then when you hit a harder one, you're already kind of in the zone. This worked really well for me for programming. Started doing it for design. Works really well there as well. I tend to have meetings in the late morning. Certain kinds of meetings happen late morning. And for me, late morning is 10 or 11 in the morning. Sometimes people are rolling in. I can't tell you how many times I went to a 10 o'clock meeting and someone would roll in 5 or 10 minutes late because they literally just got to work. It was very frequently the same people. So like I said, some people just cannot deal with mornings. So the meetings that tended to be ones that I would attend as a designer were design meetings with other designers. Like you're going to talk about combat, or you're going to talk about inventory, or you're going to talk about what we want to do with quests. And you meet with other people on the team who are doing that. Other people on the design team who are doing that. Contrast this with meeting with a strike team. A strike team is a mix of developers. It's an artist, programmer, designer, somebody from audio, sometimes somebody from QA, depending on how far along the strike team is, and a producer or an AP to actually work on defined, designed features. So you may have a combat strike team. You may have a stealth strike team. You may have an exploration strike team. You may have a dialogue strike team. You may have a town strike team to actually work on. We're laying out this town. We kind of, want people involved in knowing how much rooms do we need to have? How do we make it look like a lot of people live here, even though there's not rooms for everybody? Things like that, and you get it worked out. The strike teams are also where, because there's an AP there, the AP starts tracking tasks to see if they're going along at a pace fast enough that things will get finished on time. Strike teams usually have a definitive start and end date, so they're usually assigned, like, on this milestone, we're going to do ranged combat strike team. And the idea is ranged combat will be heavily worked on by this strike team. And since they meet once or twice a week, you can steer things. Like if it turns out something's taking longer to implement, you can steer and say, well, why is it taking so long? Oh, we have a lot of ranged weapons. Let's reevaluate our estimates. Oh, we have a lot more ranged weapons than we thought we'd have. Maybe let's get rid of a few. That happens during the strike team, which is why you need a producer person there. Some other meetings I tend to go to in the morning would be meetings with other leads. Like if I was a lead system designer, I might have a meeting with the lead quest designer and the lead narrative designer and the lead level designer. If sometimes there are director meetings and they ask some of the leads to come. So like the art director and the programming director and the design director are having a meeting about the project, and they invite several of the leads from their departments to come along to talk about particular topics that are going to come up in that particular meeting. And then the last 10 morning meetings tend to be a publisher's in town. They like to come into town the night before, so sometimes you go to dinner with them, or they go to dinner with the directors or the leads. And then the next morning, meetings start. And so some of those meetings with the publisher will be in the morning. You also sometimes do marketing and PR meetings with people in those departments when they're starting to build up what the plan is for your game, especially in the last half to third of the game's development when those plans are rolled out. Then, after lunch is kind of a different vibe because everybody's there. After lunch is when I tended to have individual talks. This is when I would want to go talk to another designer for an idea I had. I call these what-abouts and what-ifs, where you go and you're like, what if we change this? Or what about adding this? And we talk about, this is when we go do things on whiteboards. Sometimes I'm going to programmers who are working on a particular design of mine, and I go in and I'm just, hey, how's that going along? Hadn't heard from you in a couple days. Want to know if you've hit anything, stumbled on anything, or had an idea about something, and I'm like, hey, has this come up yet? That's usually an afternoon thing. But I also sit down and do a lot more writing. So based on all those talks, whatever decisions were made, I dive into some of the heavier stuff. So we've chewed on things. I've done work in the morning. I've chewed on things with people at meetings and in individual talks. I try to crank out some of the heavier stuff in the afternoon. Anything I think of that's lighter goes on that to-do list for the next morning. And then some things that can happen throughout the day would be anytime an individual designer wants to come in and go over something, that could happen whenever they want to do it. We usually use Slack. So instead of it just walking to someone's room and going, I'm interrupting you, you tend to Slack them and go, hey, do you have a free 15 minutes? And they'll go, yeah, come by in a half an hour. So we do things like that. Also, the afternoon is when I noticed that's when questions would come in from programmers who were working on specific tasks from my own designs. So they might want a clarification of something. They might point out something that was left out, that now that they're coding it, they're like, hey, I don't know how big these, area of effect radii are, or could you tell me what the maximum range is you think anyone's ever going to throw anything, so I can work out how to do prediction arcs and things like that. So those are things that tend to happen throughout the day whenever those individuals need help. And then what I described to you is most of the design cycle. It's a little different at the beginning because you're really doing a lot of design docs and there may not even be other people assigned to the project yet. But later in the development cycle, you start to do a few things that only happen later. One of them is you play the game because it's now playable and there's a lot of levels and there's a lot of features put in. And you're looking for bugs, but everybody playing the game is looking for bugs. One thing a designer does specifically when they play games is to look for inconsistencies between the game and the written design. So this is the time where a designer will discover, hey, I did not want dialogue to work like this. We had a rule of like no more than 5 node player response nodes for any dialogue, NPC dialogue node, and I see several here with 7. Or you may go, hey, the ranged combat isn't, shotguns are still really powerful at a distance. I thought we talked about them having a really, dramatic fall off range. Is the data wrong? Because I looked at the data and it looks right. Could we look at the code? Those are the kind of things that QA might not catch as a bug because they're basically not, they're an inconsistency between the design and the implementation. Another thing you might do for QA, though, that would help them a lot is give them test plans. This is something we didn't do earlier on that we started doing. I mentioned in the Troika videos how the Atari QA barely tested bards or halflings, or they just didn't like them. And I remember specifically the Vampire Bloodlines QA, they didn't like playing Nosferatu. And so we discovered really bad bugs with Nosferatu because they were hardly tested. This is a good time for designers to make test plans and say, when you QA this game, test these classes, test these class race combinations, test this set of skill and perk combinations. Now, the number of combinations may be in the tens or hundreds of thousands or more. What you want to do, though, is catch some of the big ones and make sure that, hey, range characters are viable, melee characters are viable, talking characters are viable, exploration characters are viable, dialogue characters are possible, stealth characters are possible. You want to do things like that. I remember when I was playing Outer Worlds, I did an entire melee playthrough where I didn't let the character ever use a ranged weapon. And I got to one level that was almost impossible for me to play. And I pulled in the lead designer and we both played it together. And he managed to get through, but he did admit it was way harder. And it was because there was a lot of verticality to the NPCs. We fixed that. We added some NPCs that would run down. They had melee weapons only, so they'd run down to get at you. And we added some cover at the base so you could hide from the ranged attackers. And then the other thing that happens late in a development cycle is you tend to have more meetings with press. These might be video calls, or then press might actually come through. Sometimes they even have press days where they invite 5, 10, 15 journalists to come. You may be called on to give a presentation about the game. They may play the game for an hour and then have questions afterwards, and you may be invited to go to that Q&A. These are just things that happen during the development of the game that you have to be prepared for. And luckily, by this stage, as a designer, you probably have more free time than, say, the programmers or QA people. So you're called upon to do those because your knowledge of the game is pretty deep, but you probably have more free time than those other developers. So I hope that answers all of your questions, PostNuke Productions. That's as close as I can think of as what a day in the life of a designer would be. And I think it's pretty similar to my day in the life as a programmer, except I'm doing design instead of code.